Hi, everyone. I hope you had a beautiful Shabbat. This morning at Chabad and DG in Montreal, I shared my sermon from the pulpit as I usually do, and I never record it because obviously the enthusiasm and the excitement. It's about being there in the moment, and it's the one time during the week that I really get to share that moment. But some people came to me afterwards and said, "I think this one you should record," and so I'm not going to be able to give it the same enthusiasm as I shared today, but I definitely will at least share it with you. And I hope that you can, if you're in Montreal, you can join us uh, Shabbat morning, Saturday mornings at Chabad and DG. And I often, Shabbat afternoon, have these beautiful discussions on my porch. And if you want to come to one of those, you're invited, and I can send you the address if you email me. So let me kind of take you back and give you an idea for how this sermon came about. Last week, the podcaster and Dan Senor, the Call Me Back podcast, shared his State of World Jewry address at the 92nd Street Y. And it was beautiful, eloquent. If you haven't heard it, I encourage you to hear it. I'm not going to do it justice. But he spoke about this idea that after October 7th, that something cracked open in the soul of the Jewish people. It wasn't a conversion moment, it was a revelation that Jews around the world began to live louder and prouder, more connected lives. He spoke about which many of us have seen Jewish stars. This idea he spoke about of forwarding articles in the "Can you believe this" group chats, and people rallied with vigor. But what he was saying is that what we're witnessing isn't a full awakening. It's Jewish adrenaline, and like all adrenaline, it fades. And the question he asked is, what comes next? There's no question that this is our generation's test. Will we invest in our Jewish identity the way that our ancestors did? Not just with dollars, but with commitment. And he spoke about Jewish schools, Jewish summer camps, community, pride. And it got me thinking about my state of World Jewry address. I agree with almost everything he said. And again, I encourage you to watch it. But today, I took a few moments to share some of my thoughts and ideas about the future of the Jews. Almost 20 years ago, I was ended up at a symposium. The symposium was hosted by the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, and it was on a topic that was very interesting to me, and maybe it's something that will be interesting to you. The topic was, what will the Jewish people look like in 100 years? The panel featured some very prominent figures. Um, the two most prominent have passed away: the renowned scholar Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz and the acclaimed Israeli author A.B. Yehoshua, if you've heard of him. And it was hosted by NBC Nightline's Ted Koppel. And there were a bunch of others there I can't remember. Early in the discussion, A.B. Yehoshua made a bold statement. He said that, in his view, being Jewish means living in Israel, period. That according to him, Jewish life in America has no real meaning. And he went even further. He drew a sharp contrast between Israeli Jews and American Jews. For him, Jewish identity is his skin and flesh. That's how he described it. Something essential, something inseparable. But for American Jews, he claimed, Judaism was like a jacket, something that you put on and you take off. He mocked those who attended synagogue, who read from the Chumash, and then they go home and carry as if they carry on as if nothing happened, as if their Judaism was just confined to the walls of the synagogue. To Rabbi Yehoshua, being Jewish means living every moment with Jewish consciousness. And in his view, that was only truly possible in Israel. Now, Rabbi Steinsaltz turned to him and he said, if living in Israel is what defines a Jewish life, then what about the many Druze citizens of Israel? They live in Israel, they speak Hebrew, they serve in the army, they pay taxes, they contribute to society. Does that make them Jewish? And the truth is, and I know this is painful to admit, and don't get me wrong, this is not a bash at Israel at all, but it is entirely possible to live in Israel and still be very far from living a Jewish life. One can live in the land of Israel and still be, as some have put it, a Hebrew speaking Gentile. So here's my question. What does it mean to truly live like a Jew? Now, this question is not a new one. Actually, what I did was, and I hope you'll enjoy this, is I went through some of Jewish history as far back as I could go to see who asked this question. Because it's so old, well, it goes back to King David. I'll talk about that in a second. For many of us who are born Jewish, we've never had to really ask these questions. I've had the great fortune of, of knowing and being involved with people who convert to Judaism and being really awed by their commitment. And so for them, they have to ask this question. But for me, born Jewish, I never really asked this question. But maybe the real question is, how are we meant to live as Jews? What does it actually look like in everyday life? So it turns out that this question was asked many centuries ago, and not just by anyone. The Talmud tells us that the great King David, and he's become very famous because of this the show House of David. Actually, Monday night I'm giving a lecture on the story of David. You can join me for that, either in person or on Zoom. And so David himself wanted to define what it means to live a genuine Jewish life. He didn't say, as some mistakenly do today, that only someone who keeps all 613 commandments, all 613 mitzvot is really living like a Jew. He asked this question. He asked, what are the core mitzvot? What are the core commandments that define a Jewish way of life? And in the final pages of the tractate of Makot, the Talmud says, along came David and reduced it to 11 mitzvot. In other words, King David identified 11 core behaviors, 11 qualities that if a person lives by them, you can say they are truly living a Jewish life. So what are those 11? I'll talk about a few of them. The first one is walk uprightly. He said that we must be like Abraham, who followed God without question, with integrity, with trust. So walk uprightly. The next thing he said was do what is right. What this means is being honest, being faithful in your work. And the Talmud gives an example of Abba Chikiah. He was the grandson of the great Chani Amago. And he was such a devoted worker that he wouldn't even stop to greet other sages in the field because he didn't want to waste a moment of his employer's time. And that's what the Talmud says means to be righteous in your work. The third thing King David says is to speak truth in your heart. Now, this isn't just about telling the truth, it's about being deeply honest, even when no one else knows what's in your heart. And the Talmud tells a story about Rav Safra. Rav Safra was once in the middle of reciting Shema when someone came to him to negotiate a purchase. And the buyer made him an offer, which Rav Safra silently accepted, but he couldn't say so out loud because he was still praying. Thinking that Rav Safra didn't like the price, the buyer raised the offer. But when Rav Safra finished praying, he insisted on taking the original lower offer because he had already accepted it in his heart. Think about that. That's what it means to speak truthfully from within. The prophets understood that true change doesn't happen all at once. You don't take someone who's never exercised and suddenly have them run a marathon. You start with small, sustainable changes: 15 minutes of walking, one less sugary drink. And the same is true with Judaism. Start with a few core mitzvot that shape who you are, and you build from there. And the Talmud goes on to list the rest of King David's 11. Don't slander, don't harm others, show respect to Torah scholars, never charge interest, and there's others. Just 11 things, but these 11 define a life of meaning. They define a life of integrity, a life of Jewish values. Now, generations go by. And then came the great prophet Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah took it from 11 to 6. He narrowed it down. And he said to live like a Jew, he said, meant 6 things. Are you ready? Give tzedakah, give charity. Be kind and warm toward others. Don't take advantage of your friend's business. Carry yourself with dignities. And some others that I can't think about. 2 others. But what I want to bring out here is that as Isaiah, like King David before him, he focused on how to relate to other people, how we show up in the world. Now, more time passed, and this question was then asked first by King David, then by Isaiah, and then by the prophet Micah. He boiled it down to 3 things. He made it even simpler. To live a Jewish life, he said, comes down to just 3 things. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Again, the focus was on how we treat others, how we carry our relationship with God in a quiet and in a humble way. And then the Talmud ends with a powerful line. It says, then after King David, after Isaiah, after Micah, came the prophet Habakkuk. And he reduced it all to one thing. He took the 11 to the 6 to the 3 and made it 1. What's the one thing? Boil it down to one thing? This is what he said. And a righteous person shall live by their faith. And a righteous person shall live by their faith. A full Jewish life, summed up in one word: Amunah, faith. Now, when we take a step back and we look at everything the prophets demanded of the Jewish people over the generations, we notice something both surprising and a little puzzling. They only emphasized the moral commandments, the ethical commandments, the ones that govern how we treat one another. Things like speaking truthfully, like giving tzedakah, like giving charity, acting with kindness, judging fairly. But what about, I don't know, putting on tefillin? What about keeping Shabbat, eating kosher? What about building a sukkah or having a Pesach Seder? None of that is mentioned in their summaries of what it means to live a Jewish life. It seems strange. Are those things somehow not Jewish? Is is giving a coin to tzedakah more Jewish than keeping the laws of Shabbat? Is telling the truth more important than reciting the Shema? Here's the key. You see, during the time of the prophets, the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel. And in that context, the ritual mitzvot, the ones between us and God, they were a given. They were a given. They were part of everyday Jewish life. Everyone kept kosher. Everyone put on tefillin. Everyone kept Shabbat. These weren't up for debate or neglect. They were automatic. The problem was on the other side of the spectrum. The the moral, the interpersonal side. Business ethics were lacking. People were cheating. They were cutting corners. They were showing no compassion to the poor. Judges were taking bribes. Courts weren't fair. The society, the moral and ethical structure of society was falling apart. So naturally, that's what the prophets focused on. That's where they raised their voices because that was the area of weakness. Now, it was aside from idol worship, which they also condemned fiercely, because once a person stops believing in God, all morals eventually crumble. This was actually our conversation this evening at porch class. So, so when King David, when Isaiah, when Micah, when Habakkuk, when they tried to distill what it means to live as a Jew, they weren't rejecting the rest of the mitzvot. They were addressing the crisis of their generation. And the crisis of their generation was how people treated one another. But then came exile. Then came the destruction of the temple. And everything flipped. Everything changed. It was specifically in exile that the Jewish people became known as the most moral nation on earth. We became, in the words of the prophet, a light unto the nations. You may have heard that before, right? And history proves it. Ever since then, Jews have been at the forefront of compassion, feeling pain for the poor, caring for the sick, advocating for the oppressed. And if I may be so bold to say this, often more than anyone else, definitely compared to our numbers. But with exile came a new challenge. You see, when Jews lived in their land, ritual observance wasn't the issue. Everyone kept kosher. Everyone put on tefillin. Everyone kept Shabbat. It was second nature. But once we were scattered among the nations, where the lands that we were in were not our own, a weakness slowly crept in, not in our morals, but in the mitzvot between man and God. The final book to be inserted into the Tanakh, into the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, into the Holy Scriptures. You know which book that was? Now, there's a number of books called the Apocrypha that were written that could have been included in the Tanakh, but they weren't. But the last one to be included in the Tanakh was the story of Esther, Megillat Esther. We read it on Purim. And if you read the story, you'll see that the trouble began when Jews attended the royal feast of King Ahasuerus, a celebration that symbolized assimilation, a celebration that symbolized the weakening of Jewish identity. That kind of assimilation doesn't happen when a Jew is strong in mitzvot that define who the Jew is. It happens when those rituals start to slip. In exile, Jews have remained incredibly strong in the mitzvot that we share with the world. We've become incredible at helping the needy, thank God, comforting the sick, pursuing justice. But over time, and I would say especially in the last 2 centuries, and tragically, even more so after the Holocaust, our observance of the distinctly Jewish mitzvot, the ones between us and God, has weakened. And so I want to circle back to the question that we've been asking all along. What does it really mean to live like a Jew? And then in 1968, right after the 67 war, I've said this before, but I really think that right now is our generation's 1968, 50 years ago. The Rebbe started something that actually continued the path of the prophets, something we hadn't seen in a number of generations. Just like the prophets of old, who isolated a handful of mitzvot and said, if you live by these, you're truly living like a Jew. The Rebbe highlighted key mitzvot, key commandments that are most critical for the survival and the identity of the Jewish people in our generation. And the Rebbe didn't demand that every Jew take on the entire Torah at once. He didn't start with Shabbat. Instead, the Rebbe focused on mitzvot that visibly and clearly affirm Jewish identity, loud and proud. He encouraged men to put on tefillin, women and girls to light Shabbat candles, families to only buy kosher food, to fill their homes with Jewish books, to get involved even just a little in Torah learning. These, the Rebbe said, are the foundations. This is what it means to live like a Jew today. Because you can live in the Holy Land, you can speak Hebrew, you can vote in elections, you can serve in the army, and you can still be completely disconnected from what it means to live a Jewish life. The Holy Land is beautiful. Israel is amazing. But what matters is not your zip code or postal code. It's whether you're doing mitzvot that affirm who you are as a Jew, mitzvot that set you apart. And that ties into this week's Torah portion, right? As many of you know, I like to tie lots of things together. And often in my sermons, I tie lots of things together. But at the end, we bring it all together. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah says, God says, if you follow my statutes and observe my commandments, then all the blessings will come. If you think about that verse, if you follow my statutes and observe my commandments, then all the blessings will come. Notice what the Torah doesn't say. It doesn't say that these blessings are dependent on living in Israel. The condition is clear. Follow my mitzvot. Rashi, the super commentary, 1,000 years ago, he said that the word chukim, statutes, refers to the kind of mitzvot that seem irrational, that the evil inclination mocks, that the nations of the world question, like not eating pork or not mixing wool and linen. In other words, mitzvot that make us stand out. Remember, this is the same Rashi who opens his commentary on the Torah with the first Rashi, the first one. He asks the question, why does it say, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created? It should say the first commandment. If the Torah is a book of commandments, it should say the first commandment. And he says, the reason why it says this is because this book, this Torah, is our certificate of location. There are people in the future, he said this 1,000 years ago, there are people in the future who are going to come and say that we are occupiers. And we should say that in the beginning God created the world, and there was Abraham, and there was Adam and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. Moses took us out of Egypt, led us to the promised land. Talks about how we divided the land. This is our certificate of location. This same Rashi says that these chukim, these statutes that seem irrational, the ones that the evil inclination mocks, that these are the mitzvot that make us stand out. So to live in Israel, to be Israeli, the way that a Brit is British, or a Canadian is Canadian, if that even matters anymore, or a Chinese person is Chinese, that's not living like a Jew. I know it's hard to hear this, but I see this more and more. And I've never had this challenge, and I'm sure you've never had this challenge. But in the past 596 days, we've had to take sides. And more, we're having to take sides. It's the reality. You want to say it's not fair? You want to say why? We can ask questions. We're great at asking questions. But the Jew is supposed to be different. The more we embrace that difference, the more Jewish we become. So, I hope that we can take this message from the portion, from the place that we're in. My goal here was not to answer any of the existential questions that a lot of us are asking, but just to give a little perspective. I hope that we can take this to heart, and that maybe this week, tonight, today, we can choose one small mitzvah. Doesn't have to be a big one. One meaningful step forward in the mitzvot that define us. One action that reminds us, that reminds the world, this is who I am, that reminds us loud and proud. I'm not ashamed. The typical idea, it's so easy, and it's like within us, and it's how we've been conditioned to be in despair, to be in fear. That's not going to help anyone. Despair and fear is not going to help anyone. What is going to help us, you and me, is one action. Remembering who we are. Being proud of who we are. And Hashem should bless us that we should be able to take that one mitzvah. And that one mitzvah should be the mitzvah that storms the heavens, that screams to God, enough is enough. We want to live in a world of peace. We want to live in a world of tranquility. We want to live in a world of Mashiach. And may that world be today. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a beautiful and wonderful week.